When it comes to self-development, no matter the method you use, the vital point is to practice. If you're ready to transform your life and claim the potential inside of you, then you're in the right place. Welcome to The Vital Point. I'm your host, Jonathan Schecter. As a transformation coach and breathwork facilitator, I'm invested in making the dynamic landscape of personal evolution accessible. My goal is to inspire you to take action for yourself. You have the capacity to evolve and bring your intentions and dreams into the world, and there's never been so much access to so many incredible modalities that can help you on your journey. This podcast will help you learn simple methods you can use to transform your life and share the stories of practitioners who are doing the work so that you feel inspired to go and practice, because that's the vital point. On this episode, I will be sharing some personal experience in regards to trauma, and specifically in regards to trauma and psychedelics. And this is a bit of a sensitive topic. It's been something that has been challenging for me to talk about for a long time, because it's been sort of a healing in process. I've gone through this sort of process of being able to be present and talk about it. But I think it's really important for me to talk about it because it's really one of the major sort of defining moments of the last few years of my life, and something I haven't really talked about too much on this podcast. I think I've actually talked about it more on a couple of other people's podcasts. I know I started to mention it when I was on Cam's podcast on the Trip Sitting blog. But the more time has gone on, the more it's become really clear to me that this is important for me to share, because it's a part of my story. I know that there are other people that have experienced something like this, and my hope, my intention is that they can benefit from that my experience as well, that they know that, they're not alone. And also just to share about harm reduction and education in this space, because I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions about bad trips, in quotation marks, and trauma. And I'll be the first one to say that my opinions and positions about this have changed myself over the last few years. And I just wanted to share that. Before we get into it, we will be talking about some sensitive things. So just, fair warning. And also, we're going to be talking about some somatic practices, nervous system regulation as it relates to trauma, as it relates to things that might be holding you back. And so I do want to mention that, somatic experiencing is one of the things that I integrate into my integration coaching. And so if anything that you hear during this podcast resonates, I would love to chat with you more. You can always go to my website, bluemagicalchemy.com, to set up a free coaching consultation or get in contact with me. Again, that's bluemagicalchemy.com. And so in the spirit of all of this, I think the best way to begin this episode is with a somatic experiencing practice that I do with a lot of my clients, and I practice myself. And I think I actually talked a little bit about this on a previous episode last season, but it is a foundational practice called orientation in the somatic experiencing lineage. There's other ways that this is done, but the way that I'm going to demonstrate it to you so that you can follow along is from somatic experiencing. It's something that I would recommend you start doing 5 times a day if it's really helpful, if you really notice a difference. And not only is it something that I'm practicing sort of passively daily, it's something that I'm really bringing awareness to when I start to feel activation in my nervous system. And that could be with really uncomfortable feelings like anxiety or, sort of feeling triggered from traumas. Also, when I start to feel like really sort of overwhelming positive emotions, like maybe I feel really connected to source and sort of the beauty in the world. It's also something that I'm doing to pause and just notice. And so this is something that you can do yourself. I'd love for you to join in and we can just kind of drop in together to start the episode. Obviously, if you're driving, you might need to modify it a little bit. But really, in essence, what we're going to be doing is just slowing down to notice our external environment. So the first thing I invite you to do is just connect to your breath and just notice how the breath feels in the body. Notice where you notice your breath. And then, as long as you're not in a car and you need to keep your eyes on the road, I invite you just to let your eyes go where they want to go. Let the eyes slowly begin to wander. Just noticing with curiosity what they notice. Slowly letting them just wander about your external environment. If it feels like they want to get stuck to something, just notice that urge and allow them to keep taking in the environment. And as you're doing this, you can also bring in some other external senses into the experience. Notice what you feel on your skin. Maybe your clothes or the air. If you're sitting down, notice your connection to what you're sitting on. And then if you're standing, notice your connection to the floor with your feet. Notice any sounds that you hear. The sound of my voice. Anything else that you might notice. And anything that you smell as well. And just really just allowing yourself to slow down and take in the environment. I wonder what it would be like to even look behind you. And then just notice what you noticed. You might be surprised to have noticed something that maybe you've never noticed before, even though you've been in the environment multiple times. Notice if your breath is slowed down a little bit. Notice how you feel in your body. And so this is our practice of orientation. Okay, so now we're ready to drop in. So I wanted to talk about trauma specifically in relation to psychedelics and share a story from my own life. And this really came up as something that I was called to share now. Number one, because I've been putting it off for a bit. And when I had the conversation on the previous episode with Dave Hodges about the difference in potency of mushrooms, even within the same strain or the same batch, there was something that kind of struck a chord with me about my own experience. It actually helped me feel a little bit more compassionate towards myself, feel a little bit more grace. And like I mentioned in the intro, it's not something that I've talked a lot about. In the beginning of 2021, I was doing a solo mushroom journey of 5 grams, and my shoulder dislocated and fractured in the middle of the journey. And I was by myself. It was an extremely difficult and challenging experience. First of all, I was by myself. For many years I was married. And when I started to go back into doing some psychedelic work during that marriage, my ex-wife was not accepting. She didn't really understand what I was doing. And so I hid. There was, once or twice a year when I would house sit for a friend, or I would go to Detroit for a music festival, and I would have these opportunities to work with mushrooms, especially when I was house sitting and by myself. But I didn't really understand what having community or having a sitter or having a peer supporter meant. And I carried that habit with me into my future. And even though I started, in the last few years, I've been able to journey many times with my partner, who's obviously much more supportive than my ex-wife was. I still had that belief that it was totally harmless to do solo work. And the opinion that I hear a lot within the psychedelic community, which is there's no such thing as a bad trip. There's challenging experiences, sure. And, you might be really uncomfortable and, but there's no such thing as a bad trip. And I'm here to tell you that that's 100% bullshit. And saying that there's no such thing as a bad trip is minimizing that these medicines are disruptive, that these medicines can be traumatic, and minimizing somebody's trauma. And that's not helping them at all. You might feel like there's no such thing as a bad trip. I'm telling you right now, keep that shit to yourself, because it's not helping anybody that's actually gone through trauma. The reason that I just said that I think that people need to stop minimizing or telling people that there's no such thing as a bad trip is trauma is trauma. Trauma is not just what we experienced, it's how we experienced it. You wouldn't tell somebody that if you just have the right attitude about the car accident, you'll see the beauty in it, and you'll, see the lessons in it. No such thing as a bad car accident. No, trauma is trauma, period. And nobody gets to decide for you what trauma is and how you get to process that. That being said, I spent many years thinking that exact thing. There's no such thing as a bad trip. There's challenging experiences, and that people that say they have bad trips just haven't surrendered enough, or they just, weren't ready to handle whatever the psychedelic wanted to show them. And there's plenty of quote unquote bad trips that I've had over the years that didn't leave any sort of trauma. I remember an early LSD experience in high school where the dose that we took was a lot stronger than any of us thought. And we were we were in a friend's house watching Cheech and Chong. And I had this thought that if you remember the old drug PSA from, years ago, where it was like, this is your brain on drugs. And it was a egg frying in a pan. I had that thought of like, wow, and when I was in high school, like a sort of a slang for taking acid was frying. So I was like, wow, my brain is really frying right now. And I thought of that PSA. And as that was happening, I started to hear the sizzling. I started to hear the frying of my brain. And I could literally feel my brain cooking in my head, just like an egg frying in a pan. And then I started to literally feel like a runny yolk, like as if you bit into an over easy egg, coming out of my ears, and I could feel it dripping on my shoulder. And that experience went on for at least an hour. I never had any trauma from that. I don't have any reaction in my body talking about it. I could tell you some other sort of stories of things that people might, experience as a bad trip that I never really looked at that way. This was different. This was a shock trauma. And like I said, if you took the psychedelic aspect out of it, it would still be a trauma. But for some reason, because it happened in the psychedelic experience, it's not, sort of legitimate. And, don't quite agree with that. It's taken me a long time to process. This, happened during COVID and sort of in the beginning of COVID. And I was on Clubhouse a lot. And I remember Amy Dublé, who's been a guest on the podcast, but this was before she was a guest on the podcast. It was actually the first time interacting with her on Clubhouse. And I was telling this story, and she said, can you hear how your voice is like quivering? Can you hear how the activation in your voice? And I couldn't. It was the first time that anybody pointed that out. And literally, as even though I couldn't notice it in my voice, when I would tell this story on Clubhouse and no one could see me, the first few times that I talked about it, I would literally be shaking, discharging, sitting on a couch or sitting in my chair. And even right now, even though I feel so much more, settled with it, I can still feel my activation a little bit. I can feel it in my chest. I can feel a little bit of anxiousness in my stomach, like there's an urge to kind of stop talking about it. And those are moments where it's really important for me to notice and then pause and orient, like we did at the beginning of the episode. And so it's been a big journey of healing this particular thing. It's been something that I've released a lot of grief over. I've had to come to grips with letting a part of me or a particular timeline die and grieving that part. Because before that incident, I was really focused on leading mushroom ceremonies. I was really focused on really pushing and expanding in my business. And that trauma paused all that. And it's only now, almost 3 years later, that I am beginning to feel comfortable being in macro expanded states. In the beginning, I didn't feel comfortable getting into my ice bath. I didn't feel comfortable doing long extended sessions of breath work. I definitely didn't feel confident or comfortable or safe working with cannabis. In fact, I took almost a year off where I wasn't using any cannabis because my nervous system was so dysregulated that when I would ingest even a teeny tiny amount, like I would get so dysregulated. And so there was this grieving because the part of me, if you want to think about, internal family systems or parts work, the part of me that was in front when this injury occurred was my most open and vulnerable and present. It was the part of me that, like, the inner guiding intelligence that comes out and takes front stage during macro experiences. And to not feel safe being back in this part of me that I loved connecting with, I loved being with so much, was really scary. It made me really angry. I was afraid that I would never be able to get back to that space. It completely changed the trajectory of my life. Because over time, as I started to heal through working with a somatic experiencing practitioner and having these huge, just cathartic breakdowns where I was just, letting so much trauma go. One of the first things that happened was this understanding of empathy of, wow, this is what trauma is like. And at this point, I had already been doing work with, this person on complex trauma, on things from my childhood and my divorce and, teenage years and whatnot, for a couple of years. And all of a sudden I was in this place where I knew what I was experiencing was trauma from working with the complex trauma, but it was at such a different scale and intensity that it was completely overwhelming. And here I was sitting there going, okay, I've done all this inner work on myself. I've done all this plant medicine work around myself. I have a regular breath work practice and meditation practice and somatic experiencing practice. And this is still like the scariest shit that I've ever gone through. What are people that have never done any work doing? What are people that have no resources? How are they managing trauma? No wonder we have these epidemics, with opioids and, trying to escape in any way, shape possible that we can. So it really started to change my experience of what trauma was. The differences between, what's sometimes referred to as trauma with a small t, complex trauma, things that, developmental traumas or, things where maybe we didn't get our needs met, versus trauma with a big T, the shock traumas, the things like car accidents and, military trauma and sexual trauma. And it was really eye-opening. And it really, in a way, and this didn't happen right away, it really started to unlock my empathy. I wrote down a couple months back when I was doing some journaling around this. To put it in the context of Buddhism, there are three main vehicles of Buddhism, three main paths, you could call them. There's the Hinayana, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana. Hinayana is the solitary enlightenment path. Like, your goal with Hinayana is to, live a good life and not harm others, but you're mainly concerned with your own enlightenment. When you transition into the Mahayana path, you give up your pursuit of enlightenment for the intention of bringing all sentient beings to enlightenment, because you're bringing in the realization that all sentient beings want happiness. They don't want suffering. So it's like this active compassion in the world. And then the Vajrayana is skillful methods, skillful means. It's seeing that things aren't concrete, things don't have definitive meanings, and that our perceptions are shaping the way that we're experiencing reality. And through these skillful means, we can change those perceptions and transform whatever suffering we have very, very rapidly. And so my experience was, well, I had this understanding of what suffering was, that people besides for me were experiencing it, in terms of trauma. That's when I was working on the complex trauma. I was mainly like, what about me? And then after the injury, what kept coming up over and over again was like, oh my God, how are other people dealing with this? My empathy just like grew. And so, at least from what I wrote a while ago, I feel like that's when I really, truly started to understand the Mahayana path. And then the path of transformation is applying those skillful means to my work with myself and with others. It's applying the mindfulness, it's applying the breath work, it's applying the somatic awareness and the somatic experiencing, and truly being able to transform my nervous system, to transform my interoception, which is a neuroscience term for the way that my nervous system and mind are processing the data that it's receiving from its internal experience based on trauma and past experiences. I ended up having surgery and a ton of physical therapy. And there's still times where it doesn't feel safe to use my shoulder 100%. That never happened before, even though my shoulder dislocated maybe 6 times before that actual injury. So it's been a path of transformation. And maybe most importantly, it's inspired me to try to help other people. It's inspired me to begin training in somatic experiencing myself and integrating that into my coaching practice. It really gave me focus and direction about who I wanted to work with. And in fact, one of the biggest changes that I've made internally in the last 6 months is going from feeling like I need to market myself as a psychedelic integration coach to being like, no, I'm a transformation coach, and psychedelics and integrating those psychedelic experiences is one of the methods. But really what I'm helping people with is helping them transform their nervous system, helping them regulate their nervous system through awareness practices, through breath work, through somatic experiencing, and maybe through psychedelics. But I'm not trying to push people into that anymore because I understand how disruptive psychedelics and plant medicines can be and how not everybody's ready for that, especially if they're in this constant state of dysregulation because of trauma that they've experienced. Maybe before you jump into that ayahuasca ceremony or that macro heroic dose of mushrooms, we need to work together for a few months to like get your nervous system regulated, help you learn how to breathe, help you, feel more like present in your body so that when things start to dysregulate, you don't freak out and shut down and like, sort of shut off and get less benefit from these skillful means that you would have if you were more regulated and embodied. So yeah, this is me taking a step towards transparency, more authenticity, more letting you in to my process and the things that have shaped me and what motivates me to be in this field, to have Blue Magic Alchemy as a coaching practice. It's one of the reasons why I stopped just doing transformational breath work and started focusing on awareness practices and nervous system regulation through breath work with myself and with my clients. And it's really changed my perspective from, oh, there's no such thing as a bad trip, just challenging experiences, to saying, no, there are traumas that we experience in the medicine space, and those need to be dealt with very compassionately and delicately. And I'm not alone. Since I've opened my eyes and my heart to this, there are other people that I've talked to that have gone through similar things. Katrina Michelle, that's been a podcast guest a couple of times, during the MAPS conference, she was, presenting some of the research that she's a part of that's all about adverse psychedelic experiences. My partner, Ayahuasca Carr, has had a traumatic experience in the ayahuasca space, which we'll be talking about in depth more on some upcoming podcasts as well. And so I guess what I want to leave you with here is just to say that don't let anybody define your experience for you. It's okay to feel trauma and everything that comes along with that, the grief of losing that part of yourself that is gone, the feeling of, feeling unsafe in your body that comes from living with trauma, and the attempts to self-regulate and self-soothe that come maybe in unhealthy ways because your nervous system is just doing the best that it can to regulate you and keep you safe, because that's what the nervous system does. And I also want to say that you're not alone, that the situation can change. I've gone through this journey myself, and I wouldn't, I'm just watching what's happening as I say this in my body. I wouldn't change what happened to me, even though it was the most challenging thing that's ever happened to me. I wouldn't change it because it's brought me exactly to where I am in this moment. And at the same time, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. And I truly believe that it's not for anyone else to define or tell you, like, there's a lesson in it, it happened for a reason, all those things that people kind of say that really aren't trauma informed or supportive. And I've also done a ton of work on myself around this over the last few years to get back to where I feel today, where I can get into an ice bath. I can work out. I do have a healthy shoulder. I can work with mushrooms and cannabis again without feeling extremely dysregulated. Um, During that part where I stopped working with all medicines and everything that was dysregulating, one of the reasons that was happening was I had tachycardia, which is where your heart rate just goes up without any real reason. And I got a ton of tests. I went to 3 different cardiologists and a ton of other doctors. And once we had ruled out the fact that there was really nothing wrong with my heart, we started to zero in on what I knew from the get-go, which was there was something really dysregulated in my nervous system that was causing my heart rate to spike. And that was where I started to treat my breathwork practice differently. It's where I started to get involved in slow breathing. And, I want to give credit to Connie Basowski, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, for her coaching me through some of that. And the coaching sessions that we did were truly transformative. That, I worked with a neurologist. I was doing all kinds of herbs. I completely changed my sleep pattern and my daily routines so that I could help fix my nervous system. And it still was this process of multi-years of work to get where I am now. I'm still healing that. So if any of this is resonating with you and you're feeling hopeless or lost or overwhelmed, please give yourself a break. Please be gentle and compassionate. And for me, when I look at my life or the life of my clients through the lens of the nervous system, that their nervous system gets dysregulated because of trauma, and then we're just trying to fix that any way that we can, even if those ways are unhealthy, it helps me make sense of that. It helps me have compassion for myself or that other person. And it helps to take away the shame and the guilt that we feel around these events that aren't helping anything. They're not helping anything. So I think I'm going to leave it there. And I would invite you, first of all, if any of this resonated, please reach out, leave me a comment. If you're interested in doing some work around this, happy to sit down and talk about whether we're a good fit to work together. You can reach me at my website, bluemagicalchemy.com. And secondly, let's end with that orientation practice again. So again, just taking a nice deep breath to connect. Maybe some of the things I've been talking about during this podcast have activated some things in your body that you may or may not have been aware of. But just notice your breath. Let your belly expand. Let your diaphragm expand as you breathe, and just let your eyes wander. Let the eyes go where they want to go. And just let them explore for the next 30 seconds or so. Bringing in any sounds you hear. Letting yourself feel your body and the sensations and the feelings in the body. And just know that you can always use this resource as a way to reset and help regulate the nervous system. So I sincerely hope that you found value and inspiration in this episode. If it struck a chord with you, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could take a moment and leave me a review. It's a simple, cost-free way to show support and help more like-minded people discover the show. Also, make sure that you sign up for my newsletter at bluemagicalchemy.com to be the first to get updates, exclusive content, and insights delivered straight to your inbox. It's a fantastic way to stay connected and keep the learning journey going. And if you're ready to dive deeper into transformation through integration coaching, breathwork, and meditation, or some of the somatic work that we talked about during this episode, I'm here to support you. One of the best ways to learn about my offerings is through my website or on Instagram at Blue Magic Alchemy, where I post a lot of content to help seekers like yourself learn hands-on methods for their personal exploration and development, just like I do on this podcast. Remember, it's not about the method you choose or the pace at which you travel. The vital point is to consistently show up for yourself and practice. As the saying goes, it's not the destination, but the journey that truly matters. And I would be honored to accompany you on yours. So don't hesitate to reach out, connect, share your journey, successes, and challenges alike. I'm just an email, DM, or review away. Let's journey, grow, and transform together. Thank you again for tuning in. Until our next episode, keep exploring, keep growing, and above all, keep practicing, because that's the vital point.